And welcome to another quick tutorial here with Project Dog Waffle. PD Howler is going to be used here now at version 9.6. And one thing I'd like to do is explain how to create sort of a sphere that's rotating, so a turning, rotating sphere with any sort of image in it, or even an animation, or some text message, some, I don't know, titles, or just some sort of a banner. In this case, for instance, this was inspired by a user who has some cloud patterns, or cloud, what do we call them? Cloud images. I'll take this one here. I'll right-click this and copy this image and switch over. So you see, I'm kind of lazy. I don't want to save it to file, but of course you might have it on a file and want to load it that way as well. But you can also work through the clipboard. So I just copied that image from the email into the clipboard, and I'm going to Control V to paste it into the clipboard, or I might go paste it. Let's see, clipboard, paste new image. So now it's in my program to use as an image, and we'll just very quickly do what we want to do with that, and then we'll go in a little bit more detail, step-by-step discussion. So one thing I'll do is I'll create an animation from that. When you create an animation, you can say, oh, maybe I need just 360 frames, and if I play them at 30 frames a second, I could have basically a rotation of 1 degree per frame, and that'll make a nice smooth. But sometimes you like it even smoother, so can you go to higher? And that really depends on how much memory you have and how much memory you need. And you see here we're going over the limit of a 32-bit program, so we'll need to be perhaps 600. That's still a little bit too high. The math here is not fully reliable, but when it's going into the red, you know it's too big. Let's see, 500 frames, let's say 400. And at some point, you're going to be around the 2 gigabytes here. If you don't want to be too close, 360 is a fairly good one. And really, you need to decide if you want to do a full turn that's going to be a looping animation, or whether you only need it for just a very short segment. 360 frames at 30 frames a second, that's pretty long. That's 12 seconds long. So you got to think, is this actually going to really be needed? Maybe we need it smaller, maybe we need it just the dimensions reduced. So we'll see a couple of other options there, but I'm going to take just about half of that. Let's do 180 just for starters. And so we have an animation now. All frames are the same, and at some point we'll grab the Spherize tool and map that to the sphere, but we're not quite there yet. So what we need to do is perhaps store this animation, because we're going to work with this. Let's store this to disk. That's really an important part of the workflow, to occasionally store them, and in fact to disk allows you to get back to them if you need to. We have a tutorial on that somewhere as well on the YouTube channel. So depending on the speed of your hard drive, this might take a few seconds. But now what we can do is shift this. We want to shift, let's say we want to shift this from right to left, right? So that it's going to actually go through the sphere and appear to be a rotating sphere, because it's actually shifting before we spherize it. So what you can do, you can see there is in the transform group, there is a filter called shift, but that one will apply the same shift to each of the frames. We need a progression on that. We need a timeline with keyframes, and that's what you do here. So you go to the timeline, or you can go to animation and get the timeline, and with that you can choose very similar filters, almost the same ones, and not all of them are there. There's a few more here than you see in the main filters, so they're not exactly the same, but you see groups like convolve, sharpen, convolve, noise. If you go 3 clicks down on this scroll bar, you'll be in the transform group. So you see that here, convolve, noise, transform, and there's a shift, and if we're lucky, here we go, there's a shift option here too. So let's grab that, and you can shift the image and keyframe things. Now if we reset it, it'll be at its initial position, and then we can just grab the slider to say all I need is a shift along the horizontal. Now you can go 100%, right, if you go to exactly 100, so that'll make a full shift from left to right. You can go twice as fast at 200%. We don't need that necessarily. You can also say, well, let's start a little bit off at the -50 and then go over to +50, right? So you kind of cover the text from left to right without seeing the end of it too much first. So that's perhaps what we'll do here. And it certainly helps if the image is tileable. But you know, we'll cover perhaps some other scenarios. It also helps if you don't worry about it being exactly 50. It's at times a bit difficult to go to exactly the 50. So you know what? Let's just start with the default at 0. Let's assume we are on the first frame here and keyframe that. And then we'll go and expand this a little bit to get more granularity, to really make sure we are at the very last frame here. And then we set the X translate to 100. There you go. And keyframe that. And then, so we have now a transition or a progression of one of these values. We want to also make that one go, uncheck this, because we don't want a smooth spline interpolation. We want a steady linear interpolation. Right. So it just keeps moving at the same speed. That way it's more likely repeatable, or you can use it in a loop. It's loopable without seeing a jump from the end back to the beginning in terms of how fast it moves. So let's go and render that or apply that. And so now it's basically transitioning the amount of shift from frame to frame with an increasing amount in the x-axis. All right, so we have this. We can click play and we can see the animation so far. That's a good one to store as well. So let's go do an animation store to disk again. And that way we have another snapshot of this. And the next thing we want to do is to spherize that, right? I mean, there's tons of other things you might want to do first. Perhaps adjust the brightness, you know, make it more black and white, higher contrast, all sorts of things. If the image is not perfect yet, you can go to the filters menu and do all sorts of adjustments or color changes and so on. But at some point we'll be ready to use the transform filter called Spherize. And so let's go do that. And with the Spherize filter, you have a couple of controls. First of all, the size of the sphere. You can adjust that a little bit. Don't make it too big, because we need to have a little bit of a margin around it in case we need to crop it or do some other repositioning. There's also a light source here, and there's another one here. This one has a little bit more of a bluish tint. But if you really don't care about the light sources to be distinct, you can just place them roughly in the middle here, and then make them overlap. Perhaps give them to full intensity, and perhaps even reduce the other one. So there's really just one light source. That might work. If you need it brighter, add the other one as well. And then with that, you actually get a nice little fall off to the right. But you also have this specular highlight here, and you see that here, the specular option. You could disable that, bring it down to 0, or you could adjust the hardness of that so it's a little bit more, a very small spot here. It really depends on what you want to do with this animation. So let's go reduce this, for instance, here. You can reduce the distance, so the light source is very close or very far from the sphere. And let's see other parameters, kind of a bluish halo around it, almost like an atmospheric glow. You can get rid of that. You have the ambient part. Now, so the ambient part, if you really want it to fade to dark along the sides, you would probably want to have not too much ambient. If you increase the ambient, you will see more of the text or more of that image along the sides as well. So perhaps totally no ambient, no blue, or maybe some of it. It really depends on what your intentions are with this image or this animation. Let's not do the bump at this point and just animate that. So here we go, click animate, and do we want to apply this filter across all frames? So that's the magic now, right? I mean, if the image, the animation, or the frames of this animation were not moving yet, we wouldn't see any change. It would just be the same spherized image all across the animation. But because we shifted it, pre-animated, or made an animation on that, we now have a sequence of images that are shifting, and we're applying the Spherize to that at that point. And so now we are having this intended result of a sphere that seems to be rotating, because the animation that it's actually spherizing is shifting sideways. Alright, so that's a nice step also. We may want to save that, at least here, as a dog waffle animation, DWA. Or this one here to disk saves it actually as also a DWA dog waffle animation file on disk in a temp folder. And so it's a quick one for your workflow to move on to the next step. And that might be now at this point perhaps to get rid of the colors. Maybe you say, well, let's try that in a different tint. Right? Maybe we need to to have it first turn it to black and white. So you could go grayscale here on the image menu and look for grayscale exposed through a lens to specify perhaps what the filter color is on that lens flare, and so we can find something that kind of is suitable for a majority of these colors, or maybe hide some of them. We can also adjust that later. Let's apply that to the whole animation. That was fast. Now let's see if we can do a few other things like adjusting the value, and especially, you know, the contrast. So we could go and make it a bit more dark looking, more higher contrast. Okay, something like that. Animate this all across the frame sequence. And now at that point we might perhaps even change it back to a bluish tint or some other hue. So, you know, all sorts of different effects we can get there. I'm gonna go and change the color here by adjusting. In fact, you know what, we may want to change the color a bit more red, a little bit less blue, or something like that, all across the frame sequence, or again filter that with the timeline so that we actually have it change over time. So we could go do a color adjustment that will change over the duration of the animation, right? And maybe we want it white like this, or grayscale at the beginning as much also as at the end. Let's go to the last frame and keyframe that. And then we can go somewhere here and say, well, let's reduce the red, and we get this bluish or cyan tint, right? And then by here, along this timeline position here, we'll go and bring the red back. In fact, reduce the green at the same time, and create this. Then we go here and reduce the blue and bring it to full green, and perhaps this one here goes back to normal. So you can see how we can adjust these parameters, and you can also reposition those. So this is an interesting timeline to work with. If you want things to happen earlier or faster, you just move them down into the closer to the beginning of the timeline, and so you can control how fast these color changes are going to happen, basically as a function of how close they are together on the timeline. So let's see, perhaps we want one more where we have a lot of blue, no green, and kind of, or maybe a mix of these, something like that. So we have a couple of different scenarios, different colors showing. Let's do one more here like that. And sometimes you say that color is great, but I want it later, I want it after this one. So you move this one here, you grab this to the other side, so you can move these keyframes across there the way you want. And at some point we can now go and just scrub through that. You see at the end we are back to a white color, so same value as we had at the beginning, and at the beginning same thing, just a whitish. And this one we could go to straight line interpolation like this, or we could keep them as spline. That's fine because it's going to still be loopable. Let's go apply that and see our sphere now change through different colorings. Again, that's really one of the many things you can do with it, and you can also go and perhaps add some more magic, blur, like light diffusion or mystic vision. There's a lot of filters also in the photographic filters that will make some nice effects. Let's say some star filters for some bright spots to be a little bit glary. The blur, I like this one here, the zoom blur, the mystic vision. With the mystic vision you get these light rays. Let me increase those a little bit. See that? Almost like disco lights coming down here. And you can adjust the intensity or the level of that. The factor is how far they reach. And you can also, another really interesting effect is if you bring the quality down to just 1 or 2 levels, you see just one image copy here. It's a really interesting kind of a ghost image. I'm going to do that and a few others. Let me first store this one, and that's just to have a sort of a starting point I can go back to very quickly. Let's store this one to disk, and once I have that I can start messing with this one and add some more filters to that. Coming up, my hard drive is chugging along here. It's a little bit on the oldish side. There you go. So we go and apply our blur filter for mystic vision, and I'm gonna go with full factor, but minimal quality, so it only has one image. Because basically that's what this does, is it shows, if you increase the quality, it shows the image at increasing scale distance so many more times. And so if you go to the max, it just has so many of them that it just blurs together. But if you bring it down to the minimum quality, you have just one ghost image here, which is really an interesting effect. So let's see what that looks like. If you go from dreamy to scary, it'll be kind of a darkish appearance on top. Not exactly something very impressive. If the background is dark already, you might not see it. So let's stay with the dreamy appearance here and click animate. And so now you have two spheres. Right? It's a very interesting effect that you can create with that. You now have two spheres that are rotating and changing color in sync. So let's store this one. Let's go to there it is, animation store disk, and I want to go back to the prior one and use the same filter but with a different settings for the quality. Alright, so as soon as this one is stored, I can click here to restore this one, to put that one back in. So just a second or two. There you go. So this is the one that has the low quality rays, and now I'm going to click back on this one to restore this one, to put this one back in, and you see this one has just a single sphere and still shows the same color changes, of course, but now I'm going to go back to the blur filter and Mystic Vision, just the same, but this time I'm going to give it the full quality, and the level I might reduce a little bit. No, let's keep it at full, but the factor I might reduce, right? If these rays go too far, if they are too long, I could certainly see perhaps reducing the factor a little bit so it doesn't go that far. Okay, animate that. And so now you see a more typical or more traditional look for that same filter to give you sort of light rays, God rays, whatever you want to call them, coming through those bright parts. Other things you could do with that too is photographic filters like soft contrast improvement, or perhaps the glow, the light diffusion. Give it a little bit of a light diffusion appearance there, and animate that. And so I'll let you go with that. There's lots of different ways to use that. One more, right? We have just a single animation of this thing, but what if we had other animations on that text itself? Rather than shifting it sideways, there's lots of other animations it could go through. All right, so one thing I'll do is I'll create another animation and use it to distort this one here, and then we'll see what that looks like when we restore it. Let's see, is that the animated one? Yeah, okay, so I'm gonna eventually take this one and reanimate it, but I need to get a sort of another animation, displacement filter going, and so that displacement filter is going to be something I just create from scratch here. I'm gonna go to the let's see, filter, to the timeline, and in the timeline, all the way at the bottom, there's a Perlin noise, and in the Perlin noise, maybe I can make it a little bit faster, a little bit bigger, speed it up a little bit, and look at one or two other styles. And let's just take this one, but a little bit bigger scale, and rip it. So we could even change the parameters, but this is going to essentially generate a series of Perlin noise moving blobs that we can use as an interesting noisy deformation tool, right? A filter that will apply deformation to what? Well, to this text is very crisp and steady. What we'll do is we'll make it swim, we'll make it move, we'll give it some dancing motion by using this Perlin noise as a displacement map. So we will use the displace filters that work with this animation to apply to this animation. Right? So this takes a few seconds. It's a pretty large image, so give it a few seconds. And I'm not on the fastest computer anymore here. This is about 4 years old now. It's a nice Asus laptop, 18 screen for a laptop. Yeah, I know that's huge. It keeps me warm too. It's got a pretty nice what is it, a fan in the back that evacuates the heat from the graphics card, the CPU and the GPU, and it blows on my feet, so that's perfect in a cold winter. So here we go, we have this little animation, and this will be our displacement map. Let's make sure we store it. Store to disk. Right. And as soon as this one is stored, we can enable it as what we call the swap image. And remember, we have two images. The one you see here, the main image, and you can see in the title bar here, we're looking at the main image. But we can switch to the swap image. When you click here on this S, that switches to the swap image. And what you can do is we can actually say this animation here should be used as a swap image. So simply click here on the stored copy, use this as a swap image. Right, then you can go back to this one, apply that, and you know, this one is still what it was, but you can now apply this whatever the current swap image is, and you can take a peek here, and you see that it grabs it from this animation. You can have it applied as a displacement map. For instance, here under filter, displace by swap, right? Displace by the swap image. For instance, the pool display, pool displays. You can see how that's going to apply a displacement to all that text, and it's not a static displacement because the animation in the swap itself is moving, so the displacement is going to be moving. Let's go up, apply that one here for a try, and you can see the text is still going, shifting from left to right, but on top of that, it also is undergoing some wavy motion because of all that activity that we have in the swap image, using it as a displacement map. Alright, so with that, one final time we'll apply the transform to the Spherize filter. Spherize, there you go. And let's see, we'll make it a little bit smaller, not too small. I think we have all the other parameters still the same it was before. You can actually add more light sources, and excuse me, not more light sources. You can change the type, directional. That may give you a slightly different appearance here. For the intensity of the lighting. You have a couple of other options here. Point lights, certainly great. The distance, if you want it less impact, keep it closer so it reaches the horizon and doesn't shade on the edges here that much. And let's go. Alright, well, thanks for watching. I hope this was useful, and you'll create lots of really fun animations with that. I'll just create one more here with a very different text actually. I'm gonna go just take this one. Yep, okay, that was fun. Let's